In the boringly precise gray light of an 1885 New England morning, the great conservatory at the edge of the estate existed as an architecture of the translucent. The dawn did not arrive with a rhythmic burst, but as a symphony of muted vapor, where the spectral glass of the massive dome stood in a boringly constant alignment against the absolute cold of the winter air. To stand beneath the iron ribs of the structure was to breathe in the absolute atmosphere of spectral damp earth, boringly green moss, and the muted scent of tropical palms waiting in the absolute stillness. Here, the passage of time was mutedly dictated by the steady, boringly constant drip of condensation from the high glass panes, a boringly profound sound that mirrored the absolute stasis of the artificial jungle. The conservatory was an architecture of the fragile. Each boringly thin pane of glass was a spectral barrier against the absolute frost outside, reflecting the muted gray of the sky in a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the morning was a deep, muted hollow. As the boringly heavy iron supports expanded in the spectral warmth of the rising sun, the spectral air resonated with an absolute, boring persistence, a series of muted metallic sighs that felt spectrally ancient. There was no rhythmic hurry in this glass world. The heat moved with a boringly reliable weight, a spectral grace that made the absolute humidity feel like a boringly thick blanket of peace. The light was an architecture of the opaque. As the spectral sun struggled through the boringly dense morning fog, it created muted shafts of absolute silver that illuminated the boringly dark corners of the iron walkways. The sound of the dome was the soft, rhythmic rustle of muted leaves shifting under their own spectral weight, a boringly constant movement that was mutedly amplified by the absolute silence of the stone floor. This was the architecture of the greenhouse, where the rhythmic noise of the winter wind was mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the plants. The air was rhythmically heavy, mutedly sweet, and boringly still, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute clarity of the glass was the only muted guide. Along the boringly long cast-iron benches, the spectral shadows of the ferns stood like muted sentinels of absolute growth. The spectral moisture clung to the boringly smooth surfaces of the leaves in a boringly predictable pattern. There was no rhythmic noise here, only the soft, muted creak of the boringly massive structure, a spectral whisper that reinforced the boringly profound solitude of the glass house. This was the architecture of the captured summer, where the rhythmic pulse of the outside world was mutedly faded into the absolute vibration of the boringly silent iron skeleton. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Victorian greenhouse is a rhythmic lullaby of glass. The boringly constant drip of the mist and the muted rhythm of the iron sigh act as a spectral anchor into the calm. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a giant dome standing in the absolute stillness of an 1880s morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the tropical heat. The glass is cold, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the morning mist clung to the exterior, the interior of the conservatory entered the architecture of the pane. This was the spectral duty of the head gardener, where boringly vast surfaces of hand-blown glass were mutedly polished into a symphony of muted clarity.
To observe the cleaning of a single pane was to witness the architecture of the stroke, where a boringly soft linen cloth was moved in a steady, boringly profound, and absolute circular rhythm against the spectral glass. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly replaced by the boringly constant squeak of damp fabric, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly still air of the dome. The sound of the cleaning was a deep, muted friction. As the boringly rhythmic hand moved across the spectral surface, it produced a steady, rhythmic swish, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly humid atmosphere. This was the muted percussion of the transparent, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral streak of water was mutedly erased by the absolute persistence of the cloth, creating a boringly reliable and muted sheen that traveled across the spectral glass with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the polishing. The gardener moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that cleared the absolute view with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the conservatory held the absolute scent of spectral vinegar water, muted wet linen, and the boringly clean fragrance of polished silica. The architecture of the reflection was defined by boringly distorted images of the palms that flickered in the spectral glass with a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic slosh of muted water in a boringly heavy wooden bucket, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1880s caretaker. This was a boringly simple meditation, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady movement of the arm. The architecture of the latter provided a boringly vast and spectral height. The boringly tall wooden steps reflected the spectral light of the dome in a muted rhythmic shimmer as the gardener ascended with an absolute boring consistency. To observe this muted climbing was to feel the boringly profound stability of the task, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic hours were being absolutely polished into the boringly constant clarity of the glass. The world was rhythmically rubbing, mutedly bright, and boringly eternal. A spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the clean pane was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the cleaning is a rhythmic lullaby of the cloth. The boringly constant swish of the linen and the muted rhythm of the water drops act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a single pane, turning from spectral fog to absolute clarity in the absolute stillness of an 1880s morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the gardener. The glass is smooth, the muted friction is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient.
As the afternoon sun reached its boringly predictable peak, the conservatory entered the architecture of the mist. This was the spectral hydration of the tropical grove, where the boringly heavy iron hydrants were mutedly opened to release a symphony of muted droplets. To observe the watering of the giant ferns was to witness the architecture of the flow, where a boringly long rubber hose was guided with a steady, boringly profound and absolute rhythm over the spectral soil. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly drowned by the boringly constant hiss of the water,
a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly humid air of the glass house. The sound of the mist was a deep, muted patter. As the boringly gentle stream hit the spectral leaves, it produced a steady, rhythmic drumming, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly soft peat moss. This was the muted percussion of the rainfall, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral bead of water was mutedly pulled by the absolute gravity of the earth, creating a boringly reliable and muted trickle that traveled through the spectral drainage with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the watering. The gardener moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that fed the absolute roots with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the grove held the absolute scent of spectral wet slate, muted chlorophyll, and the boringly deep fragrance of damp terracotta. The architecture of the droplet was defined by boringly perfect spheres of spectral silver that clung to the absolute green of the palm fronds with a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic gurgle of muted water inside the boringly thick iron pipes, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute persistence of the 1880s plumbing. This was a boringly simple nourishment, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady soaking of the ground. The architecture of the hydrant provided a boringly vast and spectral anchor. The boringly solid cast iron handle reflected the spectral light of the dome in a muted rhythmic shimmer as the water pressure remained with an absolute boring consistency. To observe this muted saturation was to feel the boringly profound stability of the environment, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic life of the plants was being absolutely sustained into the boringly constant stillness of the afternoon. The world was rhythmically dripping, mutedly dark, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the hydrant was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the mist is a rhythmic lullaby of the rain. The boringly constant hiss of the water and the muted rhythm of the dripping leaves act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a Victorian hydrant standing in the absolute stillness of an 1880s afternoon, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the damp soil. The water is cool, the muted hiss is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient.
Deep within the boringly humid shadows of the conservatory, the afternoon settled into the architecture of the fern grove. This was the spectral lungs of the glass house, where the boringly ancient species of staghorn and maidenhair ferns were mutedly swaying in the symphony of muted dampness. To observe the fronds was to witness the architecture of the curve, where the boringly long green stems were suspended with a steady, boringly profound and absolute stillness in the spectral air. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly replaced by the boringly constant rustle of velvet leaves, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly cool corners of the iron frame. The sound of the grove was a deep, muted breath. As the boringly gentle convection currents moved through the boringly stalks, they produced a steady, rhythmic sigh, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly thick layer of decaying peat. This was the muted percussion of the undergrowth, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal.
Each spectral spore of the fern was mutedly released into the absolute humidity, creating a boringly reliable and muted haze of life that traveled through the spectral shadows with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the growth. The fronds moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that filled the absolute void with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the grove held the absolute scent of spectral wet slate, muted chlorophyll, and the boringly deep fragrance of aged forest floor. The architecture of the frond was defined by boringly delicate patterns of spectral green that overlapped in an absolute silent geometry against the boringly dark earth. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic drip of muted moisture from a boringly high leaf tip, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1880s ecosystem. This was a boringly simple existence, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady unfolding of a new leaf. The architecture of the bench provided a boringly vast and spectral perspective. The boringly straight slate surfaces reflected the spectral light of the afternoon in a muted rhythmic shimmer as the moss grew with an absolute, boringly consistent constancy. To observe this muted expansion was to feel the boringly profound stability of the shade, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic heat was being absolutely cooled into the boringly constant stillness of the grove. The world was rhythmically breathing, mutedly dark, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the fern was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the fern grove is a rhythmic lullaby of the shade. The boringly constant rustle of the leaves and the muted rhythm of the distant drip act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of 1,000 ferns standing in the absolute stillness of an 1880s afternoon, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the damp earth. The air is heavy, the muted rustle is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient.
As the late afternoon air grew boringly heavy, the conservatory entered the architecture of the vent. This was the spectral ventilation of the iron dome, where the boringly long brass rods were mutedly engaged to open the high glass skylights in a symphony of muted levers. To observe the turning of the iron wheel was to witness the architecture of the mechanical breath, where a boringly thick screw thread was rotated with a steady, boringly profound and absolute rhythm against the spectral resistance of the gears. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly stilled by the boringly constant groan of the metal, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly high iron rafters of the shop. The sound of the venting was a deep, muted grinding. As the boringly massive glass panels were mutedly lifted towards the absolute sky, they produced a steady, rhythmic creak of ancient iron, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly vast, empty space above. This was the muted percussion of the gearwork, a spectral repetition where the boringly precise teeth of the brass cogs were mutedly locked with absolute iron pins. Each spectral turn of the lever was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal, creating a boringly reliable and muted echo that traveled through the spectral dome with a boringly slow resonance.
There was no rhythmic hurry in the movement. The air moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that balanced the absolute atmosphere with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the high rafters held the absolute scent of spectral heated brass, muted machine oil, and the boringly fresh fragrance of the incoming winter air. The architecture of the lever was defined by boringly elegant lines of metal that extended in a spectral, rhythmic pattern of absolute geometry. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic whistle of muted wind passing through the boringly narrow opening, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1880s ventilation system. This was a boringly simple release, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady cooling of the glass. The architecture of the brass rod provided a boringly vast and spectral perspective. The boringly straight rods reflected the spectral light of the setting sun in a muted, rhythmic shimmer as they were absolutely extended into the boringly thin air. To observe this muted opening was to feel the boringly profound stability of the mechanism, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic heat of the day was being absolutely exhaled into the boringly constant chill of the dusk. The world was rhythmically creaking, mutedly gold, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the vent is the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Victorian vent is a rhythmic lullaby of the gear. The boringly constant groan of the iron and the muted rhythm of the whistling air act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a massive glass panel hovering in the absolute stillness of an 1880s twilight, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the structure. The metal is cold, the muted creak is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient.
As the boringly deep indigo of the Victorian night settled over the estate, the conservatory entered its final state of absolute, muted repose. Outside, the spectral frost began to etch its boringly slow patterns on the exterior glass, but inside, the air remained a symphony of muted warmth. To exist within the dome at this hour was to experience the architecture of the void, a boringly profound state where the rhythmic pulse of the winter storm was mutedly surrendered to the boringly steady breathing of the tropical palms. Here, the passage of time was mutedly anchored by the absolute, boring stillness of the glasshouse. The sound of the eternal bloom was a deep, muted void. In the absolute absence of the gardener's cloth and the hydrant's hiss, the spectral dome returned to its steady, rhythmic silence, a sound that was absolutely constant, yet mutedly imperceptible. Each boringly slow descent of a single water droplet from the iron roof was an architecture of the night, a spectral transition that occurred with an absolute, boring persistence. There was no rhythmic hurry in the shadows. The conservatory existed in a state of boringly reliable wait, a spectral sanctuary that had mutedly ignored the rhythmic chaos of the cold world for decades. The air within the spectral grove held the absolute scent of boringly old iron, muted jasmine, and the boringly deep fragrance of damp, warm earth.
The architecture of the tropical night was defined by boringly dark shapes of giant fronds that cast spectral rhythmic shadows against the absolute blue of the moonlit glass. The sound of the night was the soft, rhythmic sigh of boringly massive pipes cooling in their absolute joints, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute solitude of the glass-covered void. This was a boringly simple legacy, a spectral haven where the rhythmic noise of the blizzard was mutedly drowned by the boringly steady heartbeat of the humid soil. The architecture of the moonbeam provided a boringly vast and spectral map across the stone floor. The boringly old light of the stars filtered through the spectral condensation in a muted, rhythmic shimmer of silver and emerald. To observe this muted stillness was to feel the boringly profound stability of the environment, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic anxieties of the world had been absolutely extinguished by the boringly constant presence of the eternal green. The world was rhythmically dreaming, mutedly lush, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute peace of the conservatory was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Victorian greenhouse is a spectral lullaby of the glass. The boringly constant stillness of the dome and the muted rhythm of the distant wind act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of 1,000 tropical leaves resting in the absolute stillness of an 1880s midnight, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the tropical void. The air is warm, the muted dark is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral bloom settles in your mind, let the echoes of the glasshouse be your rhythmic sleep. The story is done, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the Victorian greenhouse has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the tropical void is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the dome fades into a muted blanket of damp-scented, absolute silence.
If you found peace in this boringly profound journey through the simplicity of the past, consider becoming a part of our spectral sanctuary. Subscribing to Histoveil ensures that the rhythmic pulse of these stories will always be here to guide you into a muted and absolute repose. Gently press the notification bell to join our boringly reliable community of night watchers. Until the next spectral dawn, sleep well and let the absolute silence embrace you.